When the Second World War broke out, the world was filled with stories of courage and sacrifice. Across the oceans, men left their homes to fight battles that would decide the fate of nations. But among those men, there was one who wasn't supposed to be there at all. He wasn't even old enough to shave properly. His name was Calvin Graham, and he was only 12 years old when he joined the United States Navy. Calvin was born on April 3, 1930, in Canton, Texas. He was the youngest of 7 children in a poor family struggling through the Great Depression. His father had left when he was still small, leaving his mother to raise all the children alone. They didn't have much, sometimes not enough food, sometimes not even proper shoes. But they had each other, and they had the kind of strength that hardship builds. Calvin wasn't a boy who complained. He worked small jobs, selling newspapers, shining shoes, or carrying water for neighbors. Every nickel helped his mother pay rent or buy flour. He wasn't the best student, but he was sharp, street smart, and had the kind of boldness that adults found both troubling and admirable. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Calvin listened to the news on the radio in silence. The next day, his school was filled with talk about war, about duty, courage, and patriotism. Boys older than him began dreaming of joining the military. For Calvin, that dream became a calling. He wanted to fight. He wanted to be part of something larger than himself. But he was only 12. The Navy's rules said you had to be 17 to enlist with parental consent, or 18 without it. That didn't stop him. He made up his mind that he would find a way. Calvin was small for his age but tough. He started shaving the faint fuzz on his chin so his skin would look older. He memorized the birth date from an older brother's papers, practiced speaking. After graduation, Calvin received his first orders, assignment to the USS South Dakota, one of the Navy's newest battleships. She was massive, powerful, and destined to fight in some of the most dangerous waters of the Pacific. Calvin packed his few belongings, boarded a transport ship, and left for war. For the first time in his life, he saw the ocean stretching endlessly around him. The sight filled him with awe and excitement. He was part of something bigger than he had ever imagined. Life aboard the USS South Dakota was nothing like the movies. The ship was loud, hot, and constantly moving. Calvin's job was at the anti-aircraft batteries, supplying ammunition and assisting the gunners. It was dangerous, exhausting work. The shells were heavy, and the guns never stopped firing during drills. The older sailors soon realized that Calvin, though small, could work as hard as anyone. He hauled ammunition, scrubbed decks, and learned to obey every order shouted at him. When they teased him about his baby face, he laughed and kept going. In October 1942, the ship sailed into battle for the first time. The South Dakota joined the task force defending the aircraft carriers in the Solomon Islands. The Japanese Navy was fierce, and their pilots skilled. On October 26th, the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands began. Enemy planes roared down from the clouds. Bombs whistled through the air. The ship's guns thundered back, shaking the deck beneath Calvin's feet. Smoke and flame filled the sky. Shrapnel screamed across the metal walls. Calvin passed shell after shell to the gunners, his arms aching. When a bomb exploded nearby, he was thrown off his feet. Metal fragments tore into his jaw and arm. Blood ran down his uniform, but he didn't stop. He crawled back to his station, loading ammunition with one arm until the attack ended. When he saw wounded men lying nearby, he dragged two of the He spent nearly 3 months behind bars. The days were long and silent. He was allowed to read, scrub floors, and write letters that were often censored. He felt forgotten by the very country he had risked his life to serve. Back home, his sister finally managed to contact a lawyer and pleaded for his release. After pressure from the media, the Navy finally relented. Calvin was released in April 1943. He was 13 years old, a free boy, but a disgraced sailor. When he returned to Texas, neighbors called him the Kid Veteran. Some praised him. Others scolded his mother for letting it happen. School felt strange after the war. He couldn't concentrate. The sound of sudden noises made him flinch. At night, he dreamed of explosions and fire. Doctors called it shell shock. Today, we know it as PTSD. But in those days, no one talked about such things. There was no help for a boy who had seen too much too soon. He dropped out again and began working odd jobs. He carried lumber, sold papers, and did anything to help his family. The scars on his face reminded him of battle, and the ache in his back never went away. At 16, he married a local girl and started a family. For a while, life seemed normal again. Then, when the Korean War began in 1950, he enlisted again, this time legally, in the U.S. Marine Corps. He trained hard and was determined to serve with honor once more. But during training, he fell and fractured several vertebrae in his spine. He was discharged for medical reasons, ending his military career for good. He returned home disappointed, but proud. "I did what I could," he told friends. Yet deep inside, he still felt wronged. His wartime medals were gone, his Navy record tarnished, and the government refused him any veteran benefits. Years turned into decades. Calvin raised his children and worked wherever he could find labor, construction, sales, repairs. But money was always tight. His injuries grew worse with age. Without medical coverage, he often treated himself with ice and bandages. He never forgot what happened, but he rarely spoke about it. Only when reporters stumbled upon his story years later would the world remember the boy who had fought a man's war. In the 1970s, Calvin's story resurfaced. A Texas journalist found old Navy documents proving he had served aboard the South Dakota. Veterans who had fought beside him confirmed his bravery. Soon, newspapers across the country began calling him America's youngest veteran. Letters poured in from strangers. Some called him a hero. Others said he should never have been there in the first place. Calvin simply replied, "I did what I thought was right." His case reached the Navy Board of Corrections in 1977. After reviewing evidence, the board voted to upgrade his discharge to honorable. But it would take another 5 years for his medals to be reinstated. In 1982, President Jimmy Carter signed the papers restoring his Bronze Star and Purple Heart. Cameras captured the moment they were pinned to his chest again. For the first time since the war, Calvin smiled without pain in his eyes. "It's good to have my name cleared," he said softly, but his fight wasn't over. Bureaucracy delayed his veteran benefits. He continued working despite constant pain, saying, "You can't eat medals." Then, in 1988, NBC released a movie about his life, Too Young the Hero. Millions watched as his story reached the nation. Letters from school children arrived by the hundreds. Veterans invited him to speak at reunions. Public pressure finally pushed Congress to act. In 1992, Calvin Graham was granted full veteran benefits. He received back pay, medical care, and recognition for his service. It had taken 50 years. But time had taken its toll. Decades of untreated injuries had weakened his body. That same year, at age 62, Calvin passed away in Fort Worth, Texas. He was buried with full military honors. The boy who had once lied his way into the Navy was finally laid to rest as a man who had served with honor. Today, his name is displayed at the USS South Dakota Memorial in Sioux Falls. His medals shine in glass cases. His story is taught in schools as a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and determination. Calvin Graham's life reminds us that bravery knows no age. He was punished for breaking rules, but he never broke his spirit. He fought for recognition longer than he fought the enemy, and in the end, he won both battles. He once said, "I didn't fight to be famous. I just wanted to do my part." And he did. When the train carrying Calvin and hundreds of other recruits reached the Great Lakes Naval Training Station, the boy from Texas finally realized how far from home he was. The smell of salt and oil filled the air. Shouting echoed across the docks as sailors hurried through drills. Everything was loud, fast, and disciplined. Training was tough. Reveille came before dawn. Recruits rolled out of bunks at the blast of a whistle, washed in freezing water, and marched for hours. Calvin was smaller than most, but what he lacked, in size he made up for in endurance. He worked twice as hard just to keep up. His instructors noticed his determination and gave him small responsibilities, never guessing that he was 12 years old. He wrote letters home, careful not to reveal where he was. His mother thought he was staying with relatives. Every word he wrote felt like a secret. He missed home, but told himself he belonged where he was, among the men who would soon sail into danger. After several months of training, Calvin received orders to join the battleship USS South Dakota. The ship was massive, its decks gleaming, its guns lined like rows of steel giants. It carried a crew of over 2,000 sailors and officers. To Calvin, it was a floating city, and he was one of its smallest citizens. He was assigned to the anti-aircraft batteries, where he worked as an ammunition loader. His job was grueling. Each shell weighed more than 30 pounds. The work never ended. Carrying, loading, stacking, polishing, cleaning. But Calvin never complained. He learned quickly and earned a reputation for being fast and reliable. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly around them. When the ship crossed the equator, the crew celebrated the traditional crossing the line ceremony, where first-timers were doused with seawater and laughed at by the veterans. Calvin laughed too, hiding his nerves behind a grin. For the first time in his life, he felt part of something bigger, a brotherhood forged by steel and salt water. As weeks turned into months, the South Dakota joined the thick of the Pacific campaign. The ship escorted aircraft carriers, patrolled island chains, and fought in some of the most dangerous naval battles of the war. The roar of its big guns shook the sea itself. Then came October 1942. The Battle of Santa Cruz Islands would change Calvin's life forever. It started with a blaring alarm. Japanese aircraft had been spotted. The deck erupted in motion. Sailors ran to battle stations. Engines roared, and the ship's massive guns turned skyward. Calvin grabbed his gear and sprinted to his post. He could feel the deck trembling beneath his boots as explosions thundered in the distance. Black smoke billowed into the air as anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The smell of gunpowder stung his nose. Above, the sky was filled with diving planes. The battle was chaos, a storm of fire, metal, and noise. Calvin worked furiously, feeding ammunition into the guns. Each round slid into place with a metallic clang. The heat from the barrels burned his hands through his gloves. He could barely hear the shouted orders over the roar of gunfire. Then, a bomb exploded near the ship. The force threw him to the deck. He felt searing pain across his face and arm. Shrapnel had torn into his skin. Blood filled his mouth. For a moment his vision blurred. The world spun. But when he heard the cries of wounded sailors nearby, he pushed himself up. Flames were spreading across a nearby gun mount. Calvin crawled to, ward it, pulling one man to safety and shouting for help. The air was thick with smoke. The roar of fire drowned out the engines. He stayed on deck until the attack ended, refusing medical attention until every wounded man near him was safe. When the battle was over, the South Dakota was badly damaged. Over 50 crewmen were dead or wounded. But the ship had survived, and so had Calvin. The officers took note of his actions. He was officially recommended for commendation and awarded both the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart for his wounds and bravery. For the next several months, Calvin continued to serve without complaint. He kept his injuries mostly to himself, wrapping his arm when it ached. He wrote letters home but never mentioned the battles. He didn't want to worry his family. His crewmates respected him even more, calling him Little Tex. To them, he was just another sailor who had done his job under fire. But secrets don't last forever. In early 1943, after another long deployment, the South Dakota returned to port for repairs. Reporters met the crew, eager for stories of heroism. Lists of decorated sailors appeared in newspapers back home. One list included the name Seaman First Class Calvin Graham. When the Houston paper reached his mother, she froze. Her son, the boy she thought was visiting relatives, was listed as a wounded war hero. Within days, she contacted the Navy. She was relieved to know he was alive, but horrified at the thought of her 12-year-old fighting in a war. The Navy's reaction was swift. Military investigators boarded the South Dakota and summoned Calvin to the captain's quarters. The officers asked questions he could no longer dodge. His voice shook as he admitted the truth. He wasn't 17. He wasn't even 15. He was 12 years old. The ship fell silent when the truth spread among the crew. Some laughed in disbelief. Others shook their heads in admiration. The men who had fought beside him could hardly believe that the fearless little Tex had been a child the whole time. But the Navy had no choice. Rules were rules. Calvin was arrested, stripped of his duties, and placed under guard. The same institution that had once pinned medals on his chest now called him a fraud. He was sent to a naval prison in Corpus Christi, Texas, awaiting discharge for falsifying enlistment records. His awards were revoked. His pay was withheld. His name was erased from official records of the South Dakota's battles. In a matter of weeks, the boy who had risked his life for his country was branded a criminal. Calvin's days in prison were long and silent. He was surrounded by men decades older, some hardened by war, others broken by it. He kept to himself, reading old Navy manuals and thinking about the ocean. Nights were the hardest. He missed the sound of waves against the hull, the hum of engines, and the laughter of his shipmates. He had fought like a man, but now he was treated like a child who had made a mistake. After 3 months, his sister managed to appeal to a sympathetic lawyer who convinced the Navy to release him. Calvin was freed, but his record was ruined. His discharge papers were stamped dishonorable. He was 13 years old. When he returned home to Houston, reporters tried to interview him, but he refused to talk. The local papers wrote about him as a curiosity, the boy sailor who had fooled the Navy. But for Calvin, there was nothing amusing about it. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and forgotten. The kids at school didn't know what to make of him. Some admired him, but others teased him. Teachers didn't know how to talk to him. How do you teach arithmetic to a child who has survived artillery fire? Calvin tried to settle back into normal life, but the world felt small now. He had seen too much. He carried invisible scars, memories of explosions, the cries of wounded men, the smell of burning metal. At night, he woke from nightmares, his heart pounding. No one called it trauma back then. People told him to toughen up, to move on. But how does a 13-year-old move on from war? He left school again before finishing the year. There was work to be done, bills to pay, and a family to help feed. So he went back to what he knew: labor, sweat, and silence. Even as the war raged on overseas, Calvin's battle had turned inward. He had fought the enemy abroad. Now he was fighting to find peace at home. After leaving the Navy, Calvin Graham stepped back into a world that no longer made sense to him. The noise, the crowds, the laughter of boys his age. It all felt distant. He had lived a lifetime in a few short months. The war had changed him in ways he could not explain. He tried to return to school, sitting again in a classroom where teachers talked about geography and spelling tests. But when he looked out the window, he saw flashes of the sea, gunfire over the horizon, smoke curling in the distance, the faces of men he would never see again. Books and lessons seemed meaningless compared to the things he had already survived. He lasted only a few weeks before dropping out for good. By 14, he was working full-time, sweeping floors, hauling crates, taking whatever jobs paid enough to keep the lights on at home. His mother had forgiven him for running away, but their relationship was strained. The Navy's decision had hurt them both. His discharge papers listed him as undesirable, a mark that followed him for the rest of his life. As the war dragged on, Calvin watched from the sidelines, reading newspapers about battles he understood all too well. When the war finally ended in 1945, he felt both relief and emptiness. The world celebrated peace, but inside, he felt restless. He was 15 years old and already a veteran with scars and nightmares that no one could see. He tried to move forward. In 1948, at 18, he married a young woman named Mary. She was kind and steady, the opposite of his stormy nature. They settled in Houston and soon had children. Calvin took on whatever work he could find: construction, carpentry, even sales. He was quiet about his past. Few of his coworkers knew he had once served on a battleship. But the injuries he had suffered at sea began to haunt him. The shrapnel wounds on his jaw and arm never fully healed. The pain flared up in cold weather, and headaches would leave him dizzy. He applied for medical treatment through the Veterans Administration, but his request was denied. The Navy still didn't recognize him as a legitimate veteran. His file listed him as discharged under dishonorable conditions. He tried appealing the decision, but received the same answer. He had enlisted illegally, and therefore his service was invalid. The medals he had once held, the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart, meant nothing in the government's eyes. That rejection cut deep. The medals had never been about glory. They were proof that what he had endured had mattered, that the pain and the fear and the bravery had a purpose. Without them, it felt as though the war had erased him entirely. By his 20s, Calvin had settled into ordinary life. He worked long hours and spent weekends with his family. But money was always tight. The back injury he had ignored since the war worsened with age. He refused to let his children see his pain, so he smiled through it, hiding the limp that grew worse each year. When the Korean War began in 1950, Calvin saw it as a chance for redemption. He was finally old enough to enlist legally, and he wanted to serve again, to prove himself on his own terms. This time, he joined the U.S. Marine Corps. Training came easily to him. The drills, the discipline, the camaraderie. It all felt familiar, like slipping back into a uniform that had always fit. But fate had other plans. During training, he fell from an obstacle course platform and broke his back. The injury ended his military career permanently. He was discharged on medical grounds, leaving him once again without the honor or sense of belonging he had sought. For years afterward, he carried that disappointment quietly. He worked when he could, switching jobs whenever pain or layoffs forced him to move on. He and Mary Eve eventually divorced, though they remained on good terms for their children's sake. Life went on, one modest paycheck at a time. Through it all, the memory of the South Dakota never left him. Some nights he would lie awake and hear the distant echo of engines, the hum of the ship cutting through waves. He could still picture the men beside him, laughing and swearing, faces illuminated by the orange glow of gunfire. Many of them had died before their 20th birthdays. In his own way, he felt bound to them forever. In the late 1950s, a journalist in Houston came across Calvin's story while researching wartime records. He was shocked to learn that a 12-year-old had served and fought in the Navy. The article that followed, "The Boy Who Went to War," brought Calvin's name back into the public eye. Letters poured in from readers across the country. Some called him a hero. Others called him foolish. But the story reignited an old question. Why had the Navy punished a child for wanting to serve his country? The article also caught the attention of several veterans organizations. Men who had served on the South Dakota remembered Calvin. They wrote letters verifying that he had fought bravely alongside them. They sent affidavits and statements to Washington, urging the Navy to review his case. For years, Calvin tried to petition for recognition. He wrote letters to senators, congressmen, and even the president, but responses were slow and formal. "We regret to inform you," became a phrase he knew too well. Bureaucracy moved at its own pace, and for a long time, It seemed to have forgotten him completely. By the 1970s, Calvin was in his 40s and struggling with worsening health. His back injury limited his ability to work, and his savings were running out. Still, he refused to give up. He spoke at local schools and veterans events, telling his story not for sympathy, but for awareness. "I don't want people to feel sorry for me," he said during one interview. "I just want the record set straight." Kinmout's public interest grew again when a television news program aired a segment about him on Veterans Day. Viewers were outraged to learn that the youngest decorated sailor in American history had been stripped of his honors. Thousands wrote letters demanding that the government fix the injustice. In 1977, the U.S. Navy's Board for Correction of Naval Records finally reopened his case. They reviewed ship logs, medical records, and testimony from his fellow sailors. The evidence was undeniable. Calvin Graham had served honorably and been wounded in battle. The board recommended that his discharge be upgraded from dishonorable to honorable. It was a small victory, but a powerful one. After more than 30 years, the government had finally acknowledged that Calvin's courage at sea was real. He could once again call himself a veteran. But the process wasn't over. The medals, the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart, had not yet been returned. The paperwork dragged on for another 5 years. Calvin waited patiently, living modestly in Houston, giving occasional interviews and spending time with his grandchildren. When reporters asked him if he was angry at the Navy, he smiled faintly. "No," he said. "I just think they forgot that sometimes rules shouldn't come before doing what's right." Finally, in 1982, his persistence paid off. President Jimmy Carter personally approved the restoration of his medals. At a small ceremony, a Navy officer pinned the decorations back onto his chest. Cameras flashed. Journalists applauded. Calvin, holding back tears, said only, "It feels good to have my name cleared." He was 52 years old. But recognition, though sweet, did not erase the years of hardship. His body was failing. The untreated injuries from the war and his fall during Marine training had left him in chronic pain. He had trouble walking and often needed help from Frye and Diaz to get to appointments. The government restored his medals but denied him full veterans benefits, arguing that his original enlistment had been illegal. It was another blow, but Calvin didn't quit. He had waited decades for fairness. He could wait a little longer. By the early 1980s, his story had become national news again. Reporters followed his journey closely, and veterans groups rallied behind him. He became a symbol, not just of bravery, but of persistence in the face of injustice. When asked why he kept fighting, he gave a simple answer: "Because it's the truth. I did what they said I didn't do. I served my country." By the mid-1980s, Calvin Graham had become an unexpected public figure. His story had spread far beyond Texas. Newspapers, television, and magazines called him the boy hero of World War II. People recognized him in grocery stores and at veterans events. Children sent him letters, calling him brave and thanking him for his service. For the first time since his days aboard the South Dakota, Calvin felt that his story had finally found its place in history. Still, recognition alone didn't heal the wounds that time and struggle had carved into him. The Navy had restored his medals, but the Veterans Administration continued to deny him full benefits. Technical rules about his enlistment status blocked him from receiving medical treatment and compensation. Calvin was polite but firm when he spoke about it on television. "I didn't serve for money," he said, "but I shouldn't have to fight this hard for what's right." In 1988, his story reached an even wider audience when NBC produced a made-for-television movie called Too Young the Hero. The film dramatized his experiences. The boy who had lied to join the Navy, fought courageously in battle, been punished for his honesty, and then spent decades fighting for justice. Millions of Americans watched. Many were stunned to learn that it was based on a true story. The movie's success brought him invitations to schools, veterans organizations, and historic Cal conferences. Teachers began using his story to teach about courage, integrity, and perseverance. He often spoke humbly, never calling himself a hero. There were real heroes, he told students, men who never came home. I was just one of the lucky ones. The renewed attention also helped revive the political push for his benefits. Reporters pressed Congress to take action. Lawmakers debated his case once more, and after years of delays, a bill finally passed. In 1992, 50 years after he had first stepped aboard the South Dakota, Calvin Graham received full veteran benefits from the United States government. The victory was bittersweet. His health had worsened dramatically by then. The old shrapnel wounds still ached. His spine was damaged beyond repair, and he had developed heart problems. Decades of physical labor without proper treatment had taken their toll. But the recognition mattered. It meant his grandchildren would grow up knowing that their grandfather had been vindicated, that the world now saw him not as a rule breaker, but as a sailor who had done his duty. That same year, Calvin Graham passed away in Fort Worth, Texas, at the age of 62. He died quietly, surrounded by family. His funeral was small but dignified. The Navy sent an honor guard. Flags were folded. A bugler played taps as the final salute echoed through the still air. The boy who had once lied to serve was now officially recognized as one of America's youngest war heroes. His story didn't end there. After his death, schools, museums, and historical societies continued to share his life as an example of youthful courage and moral strength. The USS South Dakota Memorial in Sioux Falls added his name to the Wall of Honor among the ship's crew. His medals, the Bronze Star and Purple Heart, are now displayed proudly, symbols of a boy's bravery in a man's war. Historians often point out that Calvin's case changed how the U.S. military verified enlistments. His deception forced a system-wide reform. After World War II, the armed forces introduced stricter age verification standards, ensuring that no one as young as Calvin could slip through the cracks again. In that sense, his story didn't just belong to the past. It helped shape the future of military policy. But more than policy, Calvin's life became a moral story. It asked a question that still lingers. What makes someone a hero? Is it the medals they earn, the battles they fight, or the courage to do what they believe is right, even when the world tells them they can't? For Calvin, heroism was never about recognition. It was about responsibility. He was a child who saw a country in need and refused to wait until he was old enough to help. He endured war, punishment, and decades of bureaucratic indifference. And through it all, he never stopped believing in the very ideals he had fought for as a 12-year-old boy. When people speak about him today, they don't just talk about the Navy or the war. They talk about resilience, the ability to keep going when the world seems determined to forget you. His life has inspired documentaries, books, and countless articles. Each generation that rediscovers his story finds something different in it: courage, rebellion, sacrifice, or hope. At the core of it all, Calvin Graham remains a symbol of human determination. He wasn't perfect. He lied to enlist. He broke rules. But in doing so, he showed that even in times of darkness, conviction can shine through. Visitors to the South Dakota Memorial often stop to read the plaque that bears his name. They learn that he was 12 when he went to war, that he fought bravely, was wounded, punished, and ultimately redeemed. Parents tell their children about the boy who became a man before his time. Teachers explain how one act of courage can change history. Veterans nod in quiet respect, understanding what words can't describe. His story has also become a reminder that justice, though delayed, is never truly denied as long as someone is willing to keep fighting for it. Calvin's persistence proved that one person's voice, steady, honest, and unyielding, can echo louder than the machinery of bureaucracy. He once said in an interview, "I didn't go to war for medals or to make a name. I just wanted to help. That's all." Those simple words sum up a lifetime of struggle, pain, and triumph. They remind us that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform neatly pressed by rules. Sometimes it wears the wrinkled clothes of a boy who refused to wait for permission to do the right thing. Today, when people talk about the heroes of World War II, they mention admirals, generals, and soldiers who led great battles. But among those names stands one that still surprises everyone who hears it. Calvin Graham, the 12-year-old sailor who went to sea, faced war, and came home to fight one last battle for truth. His life proves that bravery has no minimum age, and honor has no expiration date. The boy who became a World War II hero at 16 may have been forgotten for a time, but history caught up to him, as it always does with those who act with courage. And so his story endures, not in grand monuments or long speeches, but in the quiet respect of those who learn it. Every time a young person feels the pull of duty, every time someone stands up for what's right despite the odds, a part of Calvin Graham's spirit lives on. He left behind a legacy written not just in medals or military records, but in the hearts of those who believe that doing good is worth any cost. The boy from Texas, who lied his way into war, became a man whose honesty changed history. And though he is G1, the lesson he left remains. Courage has no age, truth has no time limit, and real heroes never stop fighting for what's right,